is canon in Dragon Ball? This is a question that pops up again and again and again. And in 2025, there was a quote by Toyotaro that ended up going around and, sparked this whole discussion again. The quote goes something like, anything and everything is canon in Dragon Ball. Look, the quote isn't inaccurate, but there's a lot more that needs to be said about what Toyotaro said and what canon is in Dragon Ball. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm not going to be doing much editing. I'm just going to talk about canon in Dragon Ball, because if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. I've been putting off this video and I've been wanting to do this for a while, ever since that quote came out, actually. So it's been a while. Anyway, before I get into the discussion though, don't forget to subscribe, help me grow the channel, and of course, leave a like, a hype, a comment. Let me know what you think about canon in Dragon Ball. What is your canon for Dragon Ball? Drop it in the comments. All right, so let's begin by defining canon. So yeah, it's the official series of works that has been determined by the people who control the rights, and they say, oh, these are the things that actually happen, so you should read or consume these pieces of media, right? Like, that's the kind of dictionary-ish definition. But let's face it, when a Dragon Ball fan asks, is this canon? What they're asking is basically two things. Should I pay attention to this? And did this actually happen in the universe of Dragon Ball?
What is actually canon? Surprisingly enough, not all of Dragon Ball Z.
Now, here's the thing. I think that in the context of Dragon Ball, the question, is this canon, in regards to a specific series, or like, for example, in Dragon Ball Super, we have like 3 or 4 different versions of the story, right? So if you're asking like, is the manga version canon? So in that context, I think the question, is this canon, can be problematic, because I think that many English-speaking Dragon Ball fans are approaching this from, their Western perspective, and they're ignoring the history of Dragon Ball and, how it's been produced, right? They're coming at it from a Marvel and Star Wars perspective. And that's not how Dragon Ball came to be, and that's not how it's being managed at this point in time. And here's the thing, there is no canon in the same way that there is canon in Star Wars and Marvel. So for those of you who aren't Star Wars and or Marvel nerds, let me expand on that just a little bit. So the Marvel style of canon is, it's all canon because there's a multiverse. So no matter what people write in a comic book, it doesn't matter, because they can just create a universe full of, for example, zombies, right? There's the zombies Marvel universe. There's the, the Spider-Man Noir universe, right? There's all kinds of universes, and every time there's a new thing that they want to introduce, but they don't want to introduce it into the main universe, they just introduce a new universe. And so again, from that perspective, if you do it this way, then anything and everything is canon.
No! Stop him! It's not canon! Stop him!
Now, in terms of Star Wars, it's also pretty simple, right? When Disney bought out Star Wars, they threw away almost all of the supplemental material, the novels, the comic book stuff that had already been published and put out at that point in time. They deemed that quote unquote legends, and then they started creating the canon again. So they started releasing novels and comic books and the games and all that stuff and the new movies, and that became, right, the new timeline, the new universe that, Disney has been making money off of, right? And they did this. This was a monetary financial decision, right? So instead of having to work with the messy universe that George Lucas had, given to them, they could reuse the most popular parts of that and then, put it back out piece by piece and make money on every time they reintroduce the character, something that was popular in the original, series of novels and all that stuff. So very elegant, very corporate, very easy to understand.
What if someone else beside you came to you and said, I want to make episode 7? Could you see that happening?
No.
Dragon Ball, though, has a very different history and a very different approach to all of this. The closest thing that we have to canon is the original 42 volumes of the manga as written and illustrated by Akira Toriyama. This is his vision of what Dragon Ball is. It's not only just words, it's also images. It's also the sequential storytelling that is manga, right? We know how Goku should look. We know how Cell should look. We know like what the technique that he did in this part of the fight, like we know how this all looked in Toriyama's head, right? And so, yeah, this is it. That there's no denying this. The closest thing that we have to canon is the 42 volumes of the manga. Everything else is basically bonus or an adaptation. So the anime is an adaptation, a very good adaptation with a lot of extra stuff. And a lot of that extra stuff is actually quite fun and enjoyable. Some of it, you know, it depends. It's subjective. That's totally fine if you don't like, for example, the fake Namek episode of, you know, Dragon Ball Z. I don't particularly like it either.
Oh yeah, we'll help you find the ball dragons.
Dragon Balls.
Yeah, that's fun.
But for the most part, right, the anime is a wonderful adaptation and very much faithful to the vision put forth by Akira Toriyama. But, right, we have stuff like the Dragon Ball Z movies or even the original Dragon Ball movies, right? Japanese fans do notice the inconsistencies, right? I've heard like English-speaking Dragon Ball, like YouTube people, at least one or two say something like, oh, Japan just doesn't care about canon. Like, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that, but I would say they don't care about it as much as the West. Like they do definitely have discussions online and you find videos here and there. And, you know, people do notice that, for example, the Dragon Ball Z movies don't match up with what we get in the manga. Like there's no way to, well, there's like one or two that you can shoehorn in, like, but no, obviously they weren't intended that way. They're just their own thing, right? So, but my point here is that Japanese Dragon Ball fans understand, they have a solid understanding that it all goes back to the manga, right? They don't always call it manga, right? They call it the Gensaku. The Gensaku is the source material, right? When they refer to, oh, that's not in the Gensaku. When they talk about the manga, like, oh, that was filler, that's not in the manga. They say that's not in the Gensaku, right? That's the word that they use. So there's a solid understanding among probably most Japanese Dragon Ball fans that it all goes back to the manga. That's where it began, and the anime is an adaptation of that. The filler stuff is the filler stuff, and don't get me wrong, there are definitely fans of Dragon Ball in Japan that don't know, you know, whatever episode of Dragon Ball Z or Dragon Ball was actually filler. Like, there's definitely people like that, but they still understand that, obviously, like, that was an adaptation of the manga. That isn't really the case for the English-speaking fandom in the 90s and 2000s. They lacked that understanding about where Dragon Ball came from, the fact that everything goes back to the manga, the fact that it's very common for Toei anime companies to come up with movies and things like that that don't directly connect back to the manga. This is all normal knowledge for your average Japanese manga anime fan, but especially back in the 90s and 2000s, no. So it was confusing, and so they're coming at it from that historical and cultural perspective, and on top of that, they're layering on the expectations about how an IP is supposed to handle canon, because we're used to doing things a certain way in the West. We've been trained to expect certain things. And so, in a way, like I said earlier, the very question of like, is this canon in Dragon Ball is kind of a flawed question, because there is no quote-unquote official canon outside of the 42 volumes of the manga. That, yeah, there hasn't been an official statement about that, but that is as core Dragon Ball as it gets. So again, I think it's extremely hard to deny that. If that's not Dragon Ball, then what is? So going back to the question, like, do Japanese people care about canon? Well, they care about inconsistencies, and it gets them confused because they're normal human beings and they think about like, oh, why did Goku do this, and then he didn't do this, and this doesn't make sense, and it's a paradox, or it conflicts, etc. Yeah, of course they notice that stuff, right? But again, I think that generally speaking, there's a better understanding of where Dragon Ball came from, and so they're able to kind of delineate, oh, this is a toy thing, this is a manga thing, so I guess I shouldn't worry too much about, the movies and stuff like that. Whereas that might not really be the case for some English-speaking Dragon Ball fans.
Dragon Ball fans are never beating the allegations. So it is somewhat a meme throughout the community that Dragon Ball fans can't read. And this comment from this fan didn't help us at all. As you guys know, the Dragon Ball Super anime is getting a new season. This fan responded to the announcement saying, "I don't want Galactic Patrol BS. I want more arc."
When it comes to the word canon, right, in Japanese, I'll tell you this. It's just not said a lot. So there's two words that are used to refer to canon in like fiction, okay? One is kanon, which is basically the Japanese, the katakana-ified, right? They just write it in katakana, they transliterate it into the Japanese alphabet, and so you get kanon, right? Again, canon. So that word is used in Japanese online fandom and like nerd circles, but it is not at all a widely understood term. This is not a term that your average person on the street is going to understand like what it means. From what I've been able to see, it seems to be used a bit more in the Star Wars fandom. Like I've seen canon and legends, right, to refer to Star Wars canon and legends. But every time, well, I won't say every time, but a lot of times when I've seen people use canon in Japanese, or kanon, they explain using a Japanese term what that means. And they'll say, 静止.
ざっくり言うと、カノンが静止。
So, 静止, 静止, written with the kanji for correct, and then shi would be history. So literally it means like correct history or orthodox history, I guess you could also translate it as. But here's the thing. Seiji is more widely understood. Yes. But even that word is not like a daily conversation kind of word. Okay. So like if you say that to a just random person on the street, like I think there's a really good chance that they're not going to know what the hell you're talking about. Maybe they might be able to figure out in context, but no. So I just don't think that it's such a hot topic and people think about it and that kind of stuff, but it's just not something that comes up as much as it does in the West. Again, maybe it's just the historical understanding of like, oh, well, manga, etc., etc. Okay. So I wanted to make that really clear here. Now let's talk about the Toyotaro quote. Okay. So the Toyotaro quote happened in a panel that took place during Japan Expo, this big anime convention in France, huge, in 2025. Okay. And there was this panel with Toyotaro, the manga artist of Dragon Ball Super, right? And Kazuhiko Torishima, who is the first editor of Dragon Ball, and he also worked with Toriyama on Dr. Slump, okay? So, famous guy, I've talked about him on the channel multiple times. And then Nakatsuru, so he did the designs for like GT, and then like especially Super Saiyan 4 and Dragon Ball Daima. Really talented guy. He's like the anime successor of Toriyama, whereas Toyotaro is the manga successor. Nakatsuru is the anime successor in that he's the one that works on the anime stuff and does those designs and all that stuff. So these three guys were in the panel, and then somebody, I'm not, well, okay. So here's the thing. This was in France, right? And the only like the closest thing to the original thing said in that panel that I've been able to find is an article in French. As far as I can tell, the original Japanese, it doesn't exist. Like, I don't know if they were recording it or not, but I can't find it online. So somebody asked, these three guys, right? I guess it had to have been in Japanese, although like, I don't know if the question was originally asked in Japanese and then, Japanese, and then there was no need for translation, or if the person who asked was, French and they had to ask in French and then somebody interpreted. I don't know. And I hate this. I hate having to rely on a translation of a translation. But the point is that the person asked, like, to you three individuals, like, how do you see canon in Dragon Ball? What's your perspective on canon in Dragon Ball? Okay. And, well, Torishima basically said, well, first of all, Torishima didn't really understand what was being asked, apparently. So there's a little note in the article. And after it was explained to him, he laughed. So that goes to show that whether they use the word kanon or seishi, maybe, like, Torishima, well, maybe they use the word canon because there's another note in Toyotaro that says Toyotaro used the word kanon, okay? So I suspect that the word kanon was used with Torishima and he didn't understand. But then it was explained to him what that meant, and then he laughed. So why did he laugh? Because I think he thought the question was just ridiculous. It was just a preposterous notion, right? The fact that you're asking that is just, you're showing that you don't understand like how Dragon Ball came to be. Basically, what Torishima says is Toriyama was messy when it came to this kind of stuff, okay? And he basically didn't worry too much about the details. He didn't overthink it. His priority was to create something entertaining. And so, you know, there is no canon, right? There's no idea of canon like we have in Star Wars and Marvel, or, you know, many other popular, you know, fiction franchises. So he basically says, yeah, that doesn't exist, right? There's nothing like that. And he laughed at the notion of it. Okay. So there you go, right? Like he basically said it, right? Toriyama wasn't approaching it like that. He was prioritizing entertainment. And so every once in a while, he either forgot or he decided to do something that may not, you know, completely match up. And so you get little problems here and there in Dragon Ball. We all know about this stuff. Okay. Now, what did Toyotaro say? Now, Toyotaro, again, full quote here on screen. Basically, he said, I think this is one of the most important parts of this statement. And this is something that a lot of people leave out when they bring up this quote, is that he says basically like he's not in a position to declare what is canon or not. Yes, absolutely, 100%. Toyotaro has zero right to determine what is canon in Dragon Ball. He does not own any rights to Dragon Ball, unless Toriyama like left him like some kind of, you know, oh, you get like 5% of Dragon. I mean, we don't know. I don't think so. You never know. But as far as we know, he owns zero stake in the Dragon Ball franchise. He is a pen for hire. Yes. He was selected by Akira Toriyama. Yes, he's a talented guy and blah, blah, blah. Okay. But he doesn't have any right to declare what is canon or not canon in Dragon Ball. So basically, he has to give the most diplomatic answer in the world because he's still on the job there. He can't say, oh, I don't think, this version of Dragon Ball Super is canon. Like, I think only he can't do that. There's too much money at stake. He can't come up with an explanation of himself. All he can say is, whatever you think is canon, go for it. Watch it, right? Do it. Enjoy it. And yeah, I think that's a valid response, right? Like, if you enjoy Tree of Might, Dead Zone, the Cooler movies, Broly movies, who cares if it's canon or not? Just enjoy it, okay? Yeah, it's not going to match up with, the rest of the franchise, right? Because those are its own little, stories. But who cares, right? Like, if you like it, you like it. That is your quote-unquote canon, right? It's kind of like how we use the term head canon, right? That's not official canon, but it's your own, it's your heart canon, okay? So, but of course the facts are the facts. Like, you have to acknowledge that, yeah, like Cooler in the 46 volumes, like it doesn't make sense, at least not in the way that it was told in those movies. So in that regard, anything can be canon. But again, he says it himself right there. He doesn't have the ability, the right to declare what it actually is canon, right? What is officially canon. And then we get to Nakatsuru. And Nakatsuru, well, again, full quote on screen right now. But Nakatsuru, he seems like such a nice guy. He's an incredibly talented guy. But he is very socially awkward. He's very introverted. He's not the kind of guy who enjoys talking in front of people. And so he gives a one-sentence answer. He says, I'm not sure. And again, he's he's still getting paid by Toei, right? He can't come out and declare anything. Nor does he have the right to declare anything. But he's also, like I said, very much like the kind of person who knows his position. He's not going to step out of line. He's not going to take a big stance there. Like, no, you're not going to get an interesting answer out of Nakatsuru almost ever because he's just so restrained. So anyway, so that is the what we got in that panel in 2025 in France. And again, I wish I could get the original Japanese and dissect it even more. But I think this is the general gist. Like, I think this is a fair characterization of what was said. The point here is that what Torishima said, and in a sense what Toyotaro implied here, is that there is no official canon. And that, in a sense, is why we get the whole problem with, well, Dragon Ball Super, with the 3 or 4 different versions of the story, at least, you know, depending on the part, and Dragon Ball Daima that has like certain aspects that don't 100% match up with Dragon Ball Super, and maybe that will be fixed at some point in time, but at least at this present moment, like saying that Dragon Ball Daima perfectly lines up with Dragon Ball Super is just not accurate, right? Like, yes, I do think that stuff from Daima will inevitably make it into the Dragon Ball mainline continuity, as I like to call it. That is the continuity that's being developed. So that's how I call it. I don't like to use the word canon because there is no canon, right? Like the canon has to be like determined, officially declared. Yeah, no. So right now it's the main continuity that's being developed. But anyway, one day they might make it clear that Daima connects without any problems, or they might just take stuff from Daima and keep including it in the Super, you know, timeline as it goes on. So the thing is that we don't have access to the source material of Daima and Super. Okay, the source material is what Toriyama wrote in text form. We don't have a manga written by Akira Toriyama and completely envisioned by him. The other complicating factor is that, well, these projects, everything after Z, right? Everything after Dragon Ball, the original 42 volumes, are corporate projects. Yes, some projects Toriyama was much more involved, right? He wrote the scripts, or he wrote the story, right? Or he wrote bullet points, or he delivered character designs. Like I said, varying degrees of involvement, but they're all projects initiated by Toei or Shueisha or whatever, like the corporate interests. And then Toriyama came along, and if he was in the mood, he'd write more. If he wasn't so much in the mood, he wouldn't write all that much, and he'd deliver some bullet points. And then, yeah, he would go over the manga that Toyotaro wrote, and then he'd give some feedback here and there. But like, it's not the same process anymore. That being said, right, the closest thing we have to like what Toriyama's vision for what he was requested to do with the continuation of the Dragon Ball franchise is his written notes and his scripts and all that. And we don't have access to that. We have little peeks here and there, right? And I think it was totally not Mark that did this video where he determined, oh, these are the common points between like the manga version of this part of Super and the anime version and the movie version. So therefore, these things must be what Toriyama wrote. Everything else is different, which means Toriyama didn't write this stuff. So you can kind of, you know, sleuth your way and kind of determine what is quote unquote canon, what was written by Toriyama. But yeah, like there is still a layer of mystery to all of that, and especially, for example, Daima, right? Like, yeah, we know that the story was not complete before it went into production, right? We know that they were still working on that, and of course, different episodes, like the actual, like, individual words, like the actual scripts, were not all written by Toriyama, right? There were different people working on this. So, yeah, Toriyama was heavily involved. He delivered probably a very detailed story, and a lot of world building and all that stuff, but he wasn't there, you know, making sure that every part of the story is exactly as he envisioned it. Like, it's just not the same as a manga. So the only way right? That we will know exactly what is, the vision exactly as Toriyama is. If we ever get like a nice book with all the scripts and everything he wrote and all this stuff, that would be amazing. Like, I'm not a fan of Super, like a lot of it, but still, I think that would be really interesting because I love to see the behind the scenes kind of thing. And I think that plenty of Dragon Ball fans would buy that. I think that there's a need for that, but I'm not sure that that will ever really happen. We don't know, right? Maybe in 20 years when Super is not like the big thing anymore and they've kind of finished that era, and who knows? I don't know when they're going to finish all this Super stuff, right? It's been taking forever. Maybe one day we'll get a book, right? And it will be money in the bank. It will be easy money for when they put that out.
Super Saiyan 4 is canon now. Run my fade. What? So you think you're gonna become canon to the main timeline instead of mine because some dehydrated scuzzer bug allegedly unlocked your potential, replacing my design and not run my fade? I know you be knocking down mountains with them big ass hands, Shaquille O'Neal.
But some of you might say, like, okay, so then fine, yeah, that is what it is. But Toei or Shueisha, whatever, they should come out and say, like, look, this is the canon. You should watch it in this order. This is the version and blah, blah, blah. We need that. And from a certain perspective, I agree with you. Like, this whole thing about canon, not canon, it's all stupid and frustrating. And there's no need for it to be like this. Like, if we got some clarity, then we could stop talking about this as much. But another thing that you need to understand is that unlike Star Wars and unlike Marvel, like, Dragon Ball is handled in a different way. So there's the production committee like method of producing anime and manga and these franchises, right? And what that is that you have these different corporate interests, like these corporations that all come together and they all put in money and they all split the rights to like these, IPs. So Shueisha, they handle the manga side of things, right? They're the ones that own like the core rights and then the publication of the weekly Shonen Jump, all that stuff, right? Like, I don't know exactly like what percentage in this. I don't think that has ever been made public. We may never know. But basically, it all began in the pages of Weekly Shonen Jump. They own the core rights, the underlying rights and the manga, side of things. Toei owns the like animation rights, right? And then Fuji TV broadcast rights and Bandai, Namco, like, video games and merchandise. And how exactly they split it up, again, I'm not totally sure. But my point here is when it comes to canon is, what is the financial benefit of declaring that the manga version of Dragon Ball Super is quote unquote canon and therefore the anime version is not canon? What is the financial benefit to that? I think that there is no financial benefit to that. I think that Toei would not like that because then that, to some degree, right, delegitimizes the animated versions, right? Or Toei declaring that the movie versions are actually canon because Toriyama was most involved with that. There's no upside to declaring that at this point in time, at least not the way that they're putting out Dragon Ball. So there is no reason for them to declare, what is canon, what is not canon. They're going to use interesting wording to imply certain things. For example, Akio Iyoku never said outright that Daima was canon, but in an interview, and I'll link it in the description. It's in Japanese though. But what he says is something like, Daima is a continuation. It's connected to the Buu saga. And so that makes you think, so this is canon, right? So is GT canon? According to Toyotaro, it is, right? So this is corporate speak. It's marketing talk, right? He has to sell that Daima is legitimate, that Toriyama worked on this. So therefore, you should pay attention to it. You should watch this. You cannot miss this. And look, there's nothing wrong with what Iyoku said. I'm not criticizing what he said. I'm just pointing out the fact that he used very specific wording. And think about it this way. A lot of what he said in that sentence, aside from the fact that Toriyama handled the story, applies to Dragon Ball GT. Dragon Ball GT connects to the Buu saga, and it's a continuation of Dragon Ball. And up until we got the conflicts with Super and Daima and all this stuff, like, now it's pretty clear that that has to be its own thing, right? GT has to be its own thing. But up until the revival era, like, GT was the continuation, the main continuity that continues the story of Dragon Ball. Like, it is what it is, even though Toriyama didn't directly work on it. He did some character design, stuff like that, okay? But he wasn't the one writing the story. So what Iyoku said there could apply, aside from that one little bit about Toriyama handling the story, could apply to GT. So you see how, like, this wording is vague and it can imply canonicity, even though he's not using the word canon or anything that makes it explicit that this is the official sanctioned work that continues the main continuity of the 42 volumes of the he doesn't say that. He doesn't say that. But he kind of implies it through the words that he uses. All right, guys, it's time to wrap this thing up because I've been talking for way too long. It's been like 30 minutes of me rambling on about Dragon Ball and canon. God. If you're still here, you're amazing. So leave me a comment down below. Leave a C down there. C for canon. All right, let's get to the conclusion. So then what do we do with this mess that is the Dragon Ball franchise? Well, the simplest explanation is there's multiple timelines going on, or there's multiple universes, or multiple continuities. Whatever word you want to use doesn't really matter. I'm just going to go with multiple continuities here, right? Everything branches from the 42 volumes of the manga. They're all official products, right? The Dragon Ball Z movies, the original Dragon Ball movies, the video games, etc., etc. Like, all that stuff is official. It's just that most of that stuff is not part of the main continuity. And at the end of the day, the most quote-unquote canon, even though I don't like using that word because I think it's problematic, is the 42 volumes of the manga. As for the super continuity, that seems to be, everything has suggested, and it's hard to argue otherwise, that is the main continuity. That is what happens after, well, not after, because we're in the 10-year time skip, before Oob shows up and the real end of Dragon Ball, right? But it's a continuation of the Buu saga, from there. Okay, so is the super timeline. Which version is the definitive version? We don't know. There's a good argument to be made that it's the movies, but not everything has a movie, so that's all up in the air. Whatever. Daima, it's a Schrodinger's cat. It seems like they're implying that it is part of the main continuity, but obviously there's discrepancies there. So I don't know. We need more time to see what they end up doing with that. And that's that, right? Aside from that, who cares, right? We can have fun with this and discuss it and make videos about this stuff and laugh about it and get super nerdy about it. But more important than all that is whether you enjoy something or not. Did you enjoy Daima? Great. Did you enjoy Super? Great. Did you enjoy the Dragon Ball Z movies? Great. That's it. That's your heart canon and go with that, right? Go with what Toyotaro said. Like, watch what you want to watch, and maybe one day we'll get more confirmation about which version is canon and this and that, where Daima exactly fits and all that stuff. Maybe. Again, I'm really curious about what will happen in the future. I know I've talked about this in other videos, I'm pretty sure, but specifically what will happen once we're getting projects that don't have Toriyama involvement. Now, how do we dissect this whole canon thing, right? I don't know, but I guess if I'm still making videos, I'll talk about it at that point.